the autumn of 1992, Claire Brennan and her 12-year-old son, Owen, left their home in Cedar Falls, Wisconsin, for a weekend road trip to visit Claire's sister in Duluth. Her husband David kissed them goodbye, expecting them home by Sunday evening, but they never arrived at their destination. They never came home. For 23 years, David searched, questioned, and grieved, until a demolition crew tearing down an abandoned roadside motel made a discovery that would shatter everything he thought he knew about the day his family disappeared. If you're fascinated by true crime mysteries and stories of families torn apart by unsolved disappearances, subscribe to True Stories Vault for more cinematic psychological thrillers that will keep you up at night. The October wind carried the scent of dying leaves as Claire Brennan loaded the last suitcase into the trunk of their forest green Honda Accord. The morning sun hung low over Cedar Falls, casting long shadows across the driveway of their modest two-story home on Birch Street. "Owen, do you have your Game Boy?" she called toward the house. Her 12-year-old son emerged carrying his backpack, his sandy hair still damp from his morning shower. "Got it, Mom, plus my comic books." David Brennan stood in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, watching his family prepare to leave. At 41, he still had the lean build of the high school track star he'd once been, though gray had begun threading through his dark hair. He taught history at Cedar Falls High School, and the October break had arrived with perfect timing for Claire to finally visit her sister. "You sure you don't want me to come?" David asked, though they'd already discussed this twice. Claire smiled, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "Catherine specifically asked for girl time, and Owen wants to see his cousins. Besides, you have those exams to grade." 200 essays on the Industrial Revolution, David said with mock despair. Owen climbed into the passenger seat, adjusting his seatbelt. At 12, he'd recently hit a growth spurt and was nearly as tall as his mother. He had Claire's green eyes and David's thoughtful demeanor. Claire walked back to David, rising on her toes to kiss him. "We'll be back Sunday evening. I'll call when we get to Catherine's." "Drive safe," David said, pulling her close for a moment longer. "I love you." "Love you too." David watched as Claire settled into the driver's seat, started the engine, and backed out of the driveway. Owen waved through the window, and David waved back, coffee mug still in hand. The green Honda turned the corner onto Maple Avenue and disappeared from view. That was the last time David Brennan saw his wife and son. By Sunday evening, when they hadn't returned and Claire hadn't called, David's concern turned to worry. He phoned Catherine in Duluth. "They never arrived." Catherine's voice was tight with fear. "I thought maybe they'd changed their minds. David, where are they?" David called the Wisconsin State Patrol within the hour. The initial response was measured. Adults had the right to travel, to change plans. But when Monday came and Claire missed her shift as a nurse at Cedar Falls General Hospital, when Owen didn't show up for school, the investigation began in earnest. The Honda Accord was found 3 days later in the parking lot of a shuttered diner off Route 41, approximately 60 miles north of Cedar Falls. The car was locked, keys missing, no signs of struggle. Claire's purse remained in the vehicle, her wallet intact with cash and credit cards untouched. Owen's backpack was gone. Search teams combed the surrounding woods for weeks. Divers searched nearby lakes and rivers. Roadblocks went up. Claire's photograph appeared on the evening news, Owen's school picture beside it. The story made regional headlines. Mother and son vanish on rural highway. But no trace of Claire or Owen Brennan was ever found. Weeks became months. Months became years. The investigation went cold. The file remained open, but hope faded like photographs left too long in sunlight. David never remarried. He never moved from the house on Birch Street. Every October, he drove Route 41, searching for something, anything, that might explain where his family had gone. 23 years passed, and then the demolition began. The wrecking ball struck the north wall of the Pinewood Motor Lodge with a thunderous crack that echoed across the empty highway. Thomas Fletcher, foreman of Fletcher Demolition Company, watched from a safe distance as the abandoned motel began its transformation into rubble and memory. The Pinewood had closed in 1994, 2 years after Claire and Owen Brennan disappeared. It had sat vacant ever since, slowly deteriorating until the county finally condemned it. The property had been sold to a developer planning a truck stop and convenience store. "Careful with that east wing," Thomas called to his excavator operator through the radio. "Structure's more compromised than the inspection showed." It was a cold morning in October 2015. The trees surrounding the old motel blazed with autumn colors, reds and golds that reminded Thomas of the falls he'd known as a child in northern Wisconsin. He'd been doing demolition work for 15 years, and abandoned buildings always carried a certain melancholy. This one felt heavier somehow. By midday, most of the motel's facade had been reduced to broken concrete and splintered wood. The crew broke for lunch, and Thomas walked the perimeter, checking for hazards before the afternoon shift. That's when he noticed something odd. Behind where room 7 had stood, the ground had collapsed inward, revealing what appeared to be a crawl space or basement access. Thomas approached carefully, testing the stability of the surrounding earth. The opening was roughly 4 feet wide, descending into darkness. "Marco," Thomas called to one of his crew, "bring me a flashlight." Thomas knelt at the edge of the hole, shining the light downward. The beam illuminated concrete walls and what appeared to be a small underground room, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet. The air that rose from the opening smelled of damp earth and decay. And then the light caught something that made Thomas's breath stop. A child's sneaker. Small, dirty, but unmistakably a sneaker designed for a young boy. Beside it, partially buried in silt and debris, the corner of what looked like a backpack. "Call the police," Thomas said quietly. "Right now." Within an hour, Route 41 was blocked by police vehicles. Detective Sarah Voss of the Wisconsin State Police arrived with a forensics team, her gray eyes sharp beneath dark hair pulled into a tight bun. At 47, she'd worked missing persons cases for over 2 decades. "Nobody goes down there until forensics clears it," she instructed, setting up a perimeter with yellow tape. Thomas explained what he'd found. Detective Voss listened carefully, taking notes, her expression neutral but alert. "How long has this motel been closed?" she asked. "Since 1994, according to county records. Been abandoned ever since." Voss nodded slowly. Something in her expression shifted, a flash of recognition or memory. "The Brennan case," she said quietly. Thomas frowned. "What's that?" "Before your time, probably. October 1992. A mother and son disappeared on Route 41. Their car was found at a diner about 2 miles from here." She looked at the collapsed opening. The boy was 12 years old. The forensics team began their careful descent into the underground room. Voss watched from above, her radio crackling with updates. Thomas stood nearby, no longer thinking about demolition schedules or property development. He was thinking about that small sneaker, about a boy who'd been 12 years old 23 years ago. An hour passed. Then 2. The autumn sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the demolition site. Finally, one of the forensic techs emerged from the opening. His face was pale, and he spoke quietly to Detective Voss. Thomas couldn't hear the words, but he saw Voss's expression harden, saw her close her eyes briefly as if gathering strength. She walked over to Thomas. "We're going to need your crew to stop work. This is a crime scene now." "What did you find?" Voss hesitated, then said, "Human remains, 2 sets, 1 adult, 1 child." Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. "The Brennans? We'll need dental records and DNA to confirm, but..." Voss looked back at the opening. "The boy's backpack has a name written inside, Owen Brennan." The words hung in the air between them. "There's something else," Voss continued, her voice lower. "The room was sealed from the outside. Heavy concrete block over the entrance, hidden behind the motel's foundation. They didn't get down there by accident." She paused. They were put there. As the forensic team continued their grim work, Voss pulled out her phone. There was a call she needed to make, a conversation she'd been dreading for 23 years. Somewhere in Cedar Falls, David Brennan was living his normal Tuesday afternoon, grading papers perhaps, or preparing dinner for one. In a few minutes, his world would shatter all over again. But this time, he would finally have answers. And those answers would be far worse than anything he'd imagined. David Brennan stood in his kitchen, the phone pressed against his ear, listening to Detective Voss's careful words. He'd received calls like this before over the years, possible sightings, leads that went nowhere, updates that led only to more questions. But something in Voss's tone told him this was different. "Mr. Brennan, I need you to sit down," she was saying. David pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, the same table where Claire had eaten breakfast 23 years ago, where Owen had done his homework. "I'm sitting. We've found human remains at the site of the old Pinewood Motor Lodge on Route 41. A boy's backpack was recovered with the name Owen Brennan written inside. We'll need dental records to confirm, but I believe we've found your wife and son." The words seemed to reach David from a great distance. His vision blurred at the edges. "Found them where?" "In a sealed underground room beneath the motel. Mr. Brennan, I'm so sorry, but this is being investigated as a homicide. They didn't end up there by accident." David heard himself ask questions, heard Voss provide careful answers. Yes, they were certain it was the same Owen Brennan. Yes, they would need him to provide Claire's dental records. Yes, there would be an investigation, a full forensic examination. When the call ended, David sat in the gathering darkness of his kitchen for a long time. He'd spent 23 years suspended between hope and despair, never quite able to move forward, never able to let go. Now the waiting was over. His family had been murdered, sealed underground like discarded things. The rage that filled him was so sudden and complete that it left him breathless. By the next morning, the story had broken. News vans lined the street outside the old Pinewood Motor Lodge. Reporters spoke into cameras about the tragic discovery, the 23-year mystery finally solved. Helicopters circled overhead as forensic teams continued their work. David drove to the site despite Detective Voss's gentle suggestion that he stay home. He needed to see it, needed to understand where Claire and Owen had spent their last moments. Voss met him at the police perimeter. "Mr. Brennan, you don't need to be here." "Yes, I do." She studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "I can't let you any closer, but I can tell you what we know so far." They stood beside Voss's unmarked car as she explained. The underground room had been deliberately constructed, a hidden space beneath what had been room 7 of the motel. The entrance had been sealed with concrete blocks and concealed behind the motel's foundation. Claire and Owen had been placed there, along with a few personal items. The backpack, a woman's jacket that matched Claire's description. The cause of death was still being determined, but preliminary examination suggested they'd been alive when placed in the room. "They were trapped," David said, his voice hollow. Voss didn't answer, which was answer enough. "Who owned the motel in 1992? "A man named Eugene Hartley. He operated it from 1987 until it closed in 1994. We're trying to locate him now." "He's not dead." "We don't know. He disappeared after the motel closed, sold it through a lawyer, never showed up for the closing. There was some suspicion at the time that he'd skipped town to avoid debts." David stared at the excavation site, at the yellow police tape and the forensic tents. "You think he did this?" "It's early in the investigation, Mr. Brennan, but yes, he's our primary suspect." Over the following days, David learned more than he wanted to know about Eugene Hartley. The man had been 56 in 1992. a drifter who'd owned several failing businesses before purchasing the Pinewood Motor Lodge. He had a criminal record, minor offenses, nothing violent. He'd been described by former employees as strange, volatile, paranoid about people stealing from him. After the motel closed in 1994, Hartley had vanished completely. No tax returns filed, no Social Security checks cashed, no activity on any known bank accounts. For 21 years, he'd been a ghost. Detective Voss organized a task force. They interviewed former motel employees, guests who'd stayed there in 1992, anyone who might remember Eugene Hartley or provide information about the hidden room. David attended every press conference, read every report Voss was willing to share. The dental records had confirmed what they already knew. The remains were Claire and Owen. The forensic analysis revealed they'd survived for several days in that underground room before dying of dehydration and exposure. Owen's Game Boy was found beside him, batteries long dead. Claire's watch had stopped at 3:47, though whether AM or PM, no one could say. The details accumulated like stones, each one adding weight to David's grief and rage. Then, 6 days after the discovery, Detective Voss called him with news. "We found Eugene Hartley," she said. "Or rather, someone who knows where he is." David's hand tightened on the phone. "Where?" "That's complicated. Can you come to the station?" An hour later, David sat across from Voss in an interview room at the state police headquarters. She had a file folder open in front of her, photographs spread across the table. "A woman named Diane Fletcher came forward yesterday," Voss began. "She was a housekeeper at the Pinewood in 1992. She'd moved to Minnesota shortly after the motel closed and only learned about the discovery when she saw it on the news." "What did she tell you?" Voss pulled out a photograph, a grainy image of a gray-haired man with hollow cheeks and suspicious eyes. "She says Eugene Hartley is her uncle, and she knows where he's been living all these years." David stared at the photograph, memorizing every detail of the face. This was the man who'd taken everything from him. "Where is he?" "Living under a different name in a small town in northern Minnesota, a place called Frost Lake. Population 300. Voss paused. "Diane says he's been there since 1995, working as a maintenance man at a church." The irony was so bitter, David almost laughed. "A church? We're coordinating with Minnesota authorities to bring him in. It should happen within 24 hours. Voss leaned forward. "Mr. Brennan, I need you to let us handle this. I know what you're feeling, but you don't know what I'm feeling." Voss held his gaze. "You're right, I don't. But I know that if you do anything to jeopardize this case, Eugene Hartley might walk free. We need to do this correctly." David nodded slowly, though something dark and determined had already taken root in his mind. "When will you arrest him?" "Tomorrow morning. Minnesota State Police will execute the warrant at 6 a.m. David left the station as the sun was setting, the October sky streaked with red and gold. He drove home through streets he'd traveled 10,000 times, past the high school where he'd taught for 30 years, past the hospital where Claire had worked. When he reached his house on Birch Street, he didn't go inside. Instead, he got back in his car, pointed it north, and began the long drive toward Minnesota, toward Frost Lake, toward Eugene Hartley. Detective Voss had told him to let the police handle it, but David had spent 23 years waiting for answers, for justice, for something that would make sense of the senseless. Now that he knew the truth, now that he had a name and a face and a location, the idea of sitting at home while others acted was unbearable. He would go to Frost Lake. He would see Eugene Hartley with his own eyes, and then he didn't know what he would do. But he was going to find out. The drive to Frost Lake took David 7 hours through the darkness of rural Wisconsin and Minnesota. He stopped only once for gas and coffee, his mind replaying every detail Detective Voss had shared about Eugene Hartley. The photograph of that gaunt face was burned into his memory now, those hollow eyes that had looked at Claire and Owen and seen them as nothing more than inconveniences to be disposed of. The highway stretched endlessly before him, broken white lines disappearing beneath his headlights. David had taught American history for 3 decades, had lectured countless students about the importance of due process, the rule of law, the careful structures society had built to prevent chaos. But tonight, driving through the empty darkness toward the man who'd murdered his family, those principles felt distant and abstract. What did law matter when your wife and son had been sealed underground to die slowly in the dark? He reached Frost Lake at 2 in the morning. The town was little more than a main street with a few shops, a post office, and a white clapboard church with a modest steeple. Everything was dark and silent under a sky thick with stars. David drove slowly past the church, noting the small house behind it that must be the maintenance man's residence. Eugene Hartley was in there, sleeping perhaps, dreaming, living a quiet life while Claire and Owen had been bones in the darkness for 23 years. David parked his car in the lot of a shuttered general store and sat in the darkness, watching the house. He had no plan, no clear idea of what he intended to do. He only knew he couldn't sit at home while others confronted the man who'd destroyed his world. An hour passed, then 2. The sky began to lighten in the east, stars fading as dawn approached. David checked his watch. 4:30. The Minnesota State Police would arrive in 90 minutes to execute their warrant. He should wait, let them do their job, go home and let justice take its course. But his hand was already on the door handle. David crossed the street quietly, the October air cold enough to see his breath. The grass was wet with dew, soaking through his shoes as he approached the small house. A single light burned in a window, a bathroom perhaps, or a kitchen. Someone was awake. He stood in the shadows beside the house, his heart pounding. What was he doing here? What did he think would happen? The rational part of his mind screamed at him to leave, to go back to his car and drive away. But the grief and rage that had sustained him through 23 years of not knowing had transformed into something harder, something that demanded confrontation. The back door of the house opened. David pressed himself against the wall, barely breathing. An old man emerged carrying a trash bag. He wore a worn bathrobe and slippers, his gray hair uncombed. Even in the dim light of early morning, David recognized him from the photograph. Eugene Hartley, 23 years older, but unmistakably the same man. Hartley walked to a garbage bin beside the house and lifted the lid. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the pre-dawn silence. He deposited the bag, then stood for a moment looking up at the lightening sky, his breath misting in the cold air. David stepped out of the shadows. Eugene Hartley. The old man spun around, eyes wide with surprise and fear. Up close, he looked fragile, diminished. The hollow-cheeked menace from the photograph had aged into something that seemed almost pathetic. "Who?" Hartley began, then stopped. Something in David's face must have communicated everything because recognition and terror flooded his features. "You're him, the husband. You remember them then," David said, his voice eerily calm. "My wife, Claire. My son, Owen." Hartley took a step backward, raising his hands. "I never meant. It wasn't supposed to. You sealed them in a room to die." "It was an accident," Hartley said, the words tumbling out desperately. "They found the room. They saw things they shouldn't have seen. I panicked. I was going to let them out. I swear to God I was going to let them out. But then I got scared and—" David moved forward so quickly that Hartley stumbled backward against the garbage bin. "You got scared? You trapped my wife and 12-year-old son underground and you got scared?" "Please," Hartley whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Please, I've lived with it every day, every single day for 23 years. I hear them sometimes, at night, calling for help. I know what I am. I know I'm going to hell." David grabbed the old man by his bathrobe, pulling him close. Hartley smelled of coffee and fear. You should have gone to the police. You should have told someone where they were. They might have been saved." "I know," Hartley sobbed. "I know. I was a coward. I've always been a coward." For a moment, David stood there, gripping this broken old man, feeling the rage inside him demanding release. It would be so easy. Hartley deserved it. The world wouldn't miss him. But then, from somewhere inside the house, David heard a sound, a woman's voice, elderly and concerned. "Eugene? Are you all right out there?" Hartley's eyes widened with new panic. "My wife," he whispered. "She doesn't know. She doesn't know anything about—" David released him, stepping back. The rage hadn't diminished, but something else had entered the equation. An old woman inside who'd married a monster without knowing it, the imminent arrival of police, the need for justice rather than revenge, no matter how much the latter called to him. "The police are coming," David said quietly. "In less than an hour. They know everything." Hartley slumped against the garbage bin, all strength seeming to leave him. "Good," he said finally. "Good. I'm tired of running." "Eugene," the voice from inside again, closer now. "You're going to tell them everything," David continued. "Every detail. Where the room was, how you built it, why you put my family there. Everything." Hartley nodded, still crying. "I will. I promise." David turned to leave, then stopped. "What things did they see? You said they found the room, saw things they shouldn't have. What things?" Hartley's face went even paler in the growing light. "There were others," he whispered. "Before them. I had a sickness. Your wife and son, they weren't the first people I put down there." The words hit David like a physical blow. "Others?" "Two before them. A hitchhiker in 1989, a runaway girl in 1991. Hartley was shaking now. "Your wife, she was a nurse. She saw the bones and she understood. That's why I couldn't let them go." David stood frozen, processing this new horror. Not just Claire and Owen, others, families somewhere who'd never known what happened to their loved ones. "The police will be here soon," David said again, his voice hollow now. "You're going to tell them about all of them." He walked away before he could change his mind, before the rage could override his remaining humanity. Behind him, he heard Hartley sink to the ground, sobbing, and the old woman's voice calling out in confusion and fear. David reached his car and sat in the driver's seat, his hands shaking. The sun was rising now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. In the distance, he could hear sirens approaching. The Minnesota State Police, right on schedule. He started his engine and drove away from Frost Lake, leaving Eugene Hartley to face what was coming. But David knew he would return. He would attend every hearing, every trial. He would look Hartley in the eye and make sure the old man understood that his cowardice, his sickness, had destroyed more than just lives. It had destroyed futures, memories that should have been made, grandchildren who would never exist. 23 years of birthdays and Christmases and ordinary Tuesday evenings that had been stolen and could never be recovered. As David drove south toward Wisconsin, toward home, the sun climbed higher in the autumn sky. Behind him, the sirens grew louder, converging on a small house behind a white church where a monster had been hiding in plain sight. And somewhere in the distance, Detective Voss was receiving a call that would tell her David Brennan had been to Frost Lake, had confronted Eugene Hartley, and had walked away. She would have questions. But for now, David just drove, watching the road ahead, finally knowing the truth he'd sought for 23 years. It was worse than he'd imagined. It was so much worse. Detective Sarah Voss stood in Eugene Hartley's kitchen, watching as the old man signed his confession with trembling hands. The Minnesota State Police had arrived to find him sitting on his back step, weeping, his wife bewildered and frightened beside him. He'd confessed immediately, asking only that his wife be allowed to leave before he provided details. Now, 2 hours later, Voss had a statement that detailed 3 murders over the span of 3 years. Michael Torres, a 24-year-old hitchhiker who disappeared in August 1989. Jennifer Moss, a 16-year-old runaway reported missing from Minneapolis in June 1991. And Claire and Owen Brennan in October 1992. The room was already there when I bought the motel, Hartley said, his voice a monotone now that the tears had stopped. Previous owner used it for storage, I think. It was sealed up, hidden. I found it by accident and I thought it was perfect. Perfect for what? Voss asked, though she already knew. For keeping them. The ones who saw too much or knew too much or were just... He trailed off. I told myself it was necessary, that they were threats. But the truth is I liked it. The power of it. Knowing they were down there and nobody else knew. Voss felt sick but kept her expression neutral. Tell me about Claire and Owen Brennan. Hartley's hands shook harder. They checked in on a Friday evening, October 9th, 1992. The woman, Claire, she was kind, tipped well, thanked me for recommending a restaurant. The boy was polite, said, "Yes, sir," and "No, sir." He paused. They were supposed to check out Saturday morning, but I saw them walking around the property Saturday afternoon. The boy had found the crawl space entrance. I'd gotten sloppy, hadn't secured it properly. What happened? Claire came to the office, said her son had found something strange behind their room, asked if I knew about it. I told her it was just old storage, nothing to worry about. But she had that look. Nurses, they see things, they notice things. She said there was a smell coming from down there. She wanted me to check it with her. Hartley paused, swallowing hard. I took her and the boy down there. I had to, or she was going to call someone. And when she saw the bones from the others, when she understood what she was looking at, she grabbed her son and tried to run. But I was stronger then. I got them both down there, and I sealed the entrance, and You left them to die, Voss finished. I told myself they'd run out of air quickly, that it would be peaceful. But I could hear them for days, calling out, begging. The boy crying for his mother, the mother trying to comfort him even though she knew. Hartley put his face in his hands. I almost went back, almost let them out. But I was afraid, so I waited until the sound stopped, and then I waited some more, and then I left for Minnesota, and I never went back. Voss closed her notebook. There's a man named David Brennan who drove up here in the middle of the night. He confronted you this morning before we arrived. What did you tell him? Hartley looked up, surprised. How did you? We have witnesses who saw his car. What did you tell him? The truth, about the others, about why I couldn't let his family go. Hartley's voice dropped to a whisper. I thought he was going to kill me. I could see it in his eyes. Part of me wanted him to. But he didn't. No. He just told me to confess everything. Then he left. Hartley met Voss's gaze. He's a better man than I ever was. Voss stood, signaling to the officers waiting outside. Eugene Hartley, you're under arrest for the murders of Michael Torres, Jennifer Moss, Claire Brennan, and Owen Brennan. You'll be extradited to Wisconsin to face charges. As they led Hartley away, Voss stepped outside into the bright October morning. Her phone was already ringing, her captain demanding updates. The media would descend soon, turning this quiet town into a circus. But first, she had a call to make. David Brennan answered on the second ring. You went to see him, Voss said without preamble. A long pause. Yes. You could have compromised the entire case. If you'd hurt him, if you'd threatened him in a way that his lawyer could use. I didn't touch him. You scared him badly enough that he was sitting on his doorstep confessing when we arrived. Good, David said flatly. Voss sighed. She should be angrier, should be reading him the riot act about interfering with a police investigation. But she understood. God help her, she understood. He told us about two others, a man and a teenage girl, both killed before Claire and Owen. I know, he told me. Their families deserve closure too. We're going to search the entire property of the old motel. If there are other remains, we'll find them. Will he go to prison? For the rest of his life. He's 79 years old. He'll die there. Not soon enough, David said quietly. After the call ended, Voss coordinated the drive back to Wisconsin. The case was solid. Hartley's confession, physical evidence from the hidden room, dental records matching the victims. It would take months to process everything, but the outcome was certain. By evening, the story had exploded across national news. The small motel that had hidden a serial killer's secret for over 2 decades. The families finally getting answers. Eugene Hartley's face appeared on every screen. That hollow-eyed photograph, now joined by recent images of him in handcuffs, shuffling into a courthouse. Voss returned to the Pinewood Motor Lodge site 3 days later. The demolition had been indefinitely postponed while forensic teams conducted a thorough excavation, and their search had already yielded results. 2 more sets of remains, buried in shallow graves behind what had been room 12, the skeletal remains of a young male and a teenage female. Preliminary analysis suggested they matched the description of Michael Torres and Jennifer Moss. But there was something else, something the forensic anthropologist had called Voss about with urgency. "There's a 5th set of remains," Dr. Rebecca Chen said, leading Voss to a cordoned area near the motel's former office. "Buried deeper, older, been here longer than the others." Voss looked down at the carefully excavated grave. Adult female, by the look of it. "How much older?" "Preliminary estimate, 10 to 15 years before the Brennans. We're talking late 70s, early 80s. Before Hartley owned the motel." "Exactly." Voss felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. So either the previous owner was also a killer or Hartley's been doing this longer than he admitted, Dr. Chen finished. "There may be more. We're expanding the search grid." Over the next week, the excavation continued. News helicopters circled daily. Reporters camped out on Route 41, broadcasting live updates. And with each passing day, the scope of Eugene Hartley's crimes expanded. 7 sets of remains in total. 7 people who disappeared between 1981 and 1992, their fates unknown until now. Some had been reported missing. Others, transients and runaways, had vanished without anyone filing reports. Voss interviewed Hartley again, confronting him with the evidence. He seemed almost relieved to confess it all, as if the weight of his secrets had become unbearable. "I was working at the motel before I owned it," he admitted. "Night manager for the previous owner. That's when I found the hidden room. That's when it started." 1981? August 1981, a woman traveling alone. She was rude to me, condescending. I followed her to her room and... He shrugged, the gesture obscene in its casualness. It was so easy, nobody even looked for her. Voss wanted to hit him, wanted to see him suffer the way his victims had suffered. Instead, she gathered his confession, documented every detail, built a case that would ensure he never saw freedom again. David Brennan attended every court hearing. He sat in the front row, his eyes never leaving Hartley's face. The trial was brief. Hartley pleaded guilty to all charges. 7 counts of first-degree murder. Life imprisonment without possibility of parole. When the sentence was read, Hartley turned to look at David. The old man's face was blank, empty of everything, except perhaps relief that the charade was finally over. David stared back, and in his eyes was something cold and implacable. Not forgiveness, never forgiveness, but acknowledgement that justice, however inadequate, had been served. As David left the courthouse that day, reporters shouted questions. He ignored them all, walking to his car in silence. He'd lived 23 years, not knowing. Now he knew everything, and somehow that made it worse. Because knowing meant confronting the reality that Claire and Owen's last days had been spent in darkness, in terror, in the slow understanding that no rescue was coming. Knowledge was supposed to bring closure. But David was learning that some wounds never close. They just become part of who you are. 3 months after Eugene Hartley's sentencing, David Brennan stood in the garage of his house on Birch Street, surrounded by boxes he'd been unable to open for 23 years. Claire's belongings, Owen's childhood things, the accumulated debris of a life interrupted. Winter had arrived in Cedar Falls, snow falling softly outside the garage door. David had finally retired from teaching, unable to face another classroom full of students who hadn't been born when his family disappeared. The school had given him a plaque, a generous pension, and sympathetic looks he couldn't bear. He pulled a box labeled Owen School Projects from the shelf and opened it carefully. Inside were drawings, essays, science fair ribbons. A mobile of the solar system Owen had built in 4th grade. A creative writing assignment about what he wanted to be when he grew up. "I want to be a history teacher like my dad." David closed the box quickly, the grief still sharp enough to steal his breath. His phone rang. Detective Voss. "Mr. Brennan, I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No," David said, stepping out of the garage into the cold air. "What is it?" "I wanted to update you on something. We've been going through records from the Pinewood Motor Lodge, old registration logs that survived. There's something that doesn't quite fit." David felt a familiar tension. "What do you mean?" "Claire and Owen checked into room 7 on October 9, 1992. We have their registration card, Claire's signature. But there's another card from that same weekend, a guest in room 12 who checked in on October 10th and checked out on October 12th. "The day after Claire and Owen disappeared," David said slowly. "Exactly. The name on the registration is Martin Cole, address listed as Madison, Wisconsin. But here's the thing. We can't find any record of a Martin Cole at that address. The social security number on the card is fake." "You think this person was involved?" "I think it's worth investigating. Hartley claims he worked alone, but 7 murders over 11 years suggests someone who was comfortable with what he was doing. Someone who maybe had help, or at least knew what was happening." David gripped the phone tighter. "What do you need from me?" "I'm sending you a copy of the registration card. It has a signature, and the handwriting analysis suggests it was written by someone under stress or deliberately trying to disguise their writing. I'm hoping you might recognize something about it. Anything that might help us identify this person." The email arrived 10 minutes later. David opened it on his laptop, staring at the grainy scan of a registration card dated October 10th, 1992. The signature was angular, almost aggressive in its strokes. Martin Cole. Room 12. Vehicle listed as a blue Ford pickup, license plate number that turned out to be registered to a vehicle that had been scrapped in 1987. David studied the card for a long time. There was something about the way the letters were formed, something that nagged at his memory. He'd spent 30 years grading papers, reading thousands of different handwriting styles. This one felt deliberate in its strangeness, as if the writer had been consciously trying to make it unrecognizable. But there was one detail that caught his attention. The number 2 in the date, October 12th, had a distinctive loop at the bottom, almost artistic. David had seen that particular flourish before. He called Voss back. "The way the numbers are written, specifically the 2s and the 7s, they have these decorative loops. I taught school for 30 years, and I remember there was a brief period in the 80s when they taught cursive numbers with those loops. It was part of a specific curriculum." "Can you narrow down when?" "Mid to late 80s. It was phased out by 1990. Whoever wrote this likely learned cursive between 1984 and 1989. So someone who would have been in elementary school during that time," Voss said thoughtfully, "making them roughly in their 30s now." David felt something cold settle in his chest. "Detective, Owen was born in 1980. He learned cursive in 3rd grade, which would have been 1988. He wrote his numbers with those same loops." A long silence on the other end of the line. You're saying the person who registered under a fake name the day after your family disappeared was around the same age as your son, a child, or a teenager. Hartley had an accomplice, Voss said quietly. A young accomplice. Over the next several days, Voss's team worked to identify everyone who would have been between the ages of 8 and 18 in 1992 and had any connection to Eugene Hartley or the Pinewood Motor Lodge. The list was discouragingly long: children of guests, children of employees, local kids who might have hung around the motel. But one name kept appearing in the records with unusual frequency: Kyle Brenner, son of Linda Brenner, who had worked as a housekeeper at the Pinewood from 1990 to 1994. According to old employment records, Linda had brought her son to work with her regularly, especially during summer months and weekends. Kyle Brenner would have been 14 years old in October 1992. Voss arrived at David's house on a gray January afternoon with a file folder and a grim expression. We located Kyle Brenner. He's 37 now, lives in Green Bay, works as a mechanic. No criminal record, quiet life. You've talked to him? Not yet. I wanted to show you something first. She opened the folder, revealing a photocopy of a school essay. This is from Kyle's 8th grade English class, written in early 1992. His mother kept some of his schoolwork when she passed away in 2003, and his aunt still had boxes of her belongings. We got permission to look through them. David took the essay, his hands trembling slightly. The title was "A Day at Work with My Mom." The content was mundane, a teenager describing the boring routine of watching his mother clean motel rooms. But the handwriting made David's breath catch. The numbers, the decorative loops on the 2s and 7s, the angular quality of the letters. It matched the registration card exactly. "It's him," David whispered. "We're bringing him in for questioning tomorrow morning. I wanted you to know before it hits the news." Voss paused. "Mr. Brennan, if Kyle Brenner was involved, he was a child at the time, 14 years old. The legal implications are complicated. He helped trap my family underground to die. We don't know that yet. All we know is he may have registered at the motel under a false name. There could be other explanations." But David could see in Voss's eyes that she didn't believe that any more than he did. The interrogation of Kyle Brenner took place the next morning at the state police headquarters. Voss had allowed David to watch through one-way glass, a concession she probably shouldn't have made but understood he needed. Kyle Brenner was a large man, broad-shouldered and thick through the middle, with thinning brown hair and a mechanic's rough hands. He sat across from Voss and another detective, looking nervous but not particularly frightened. "Mr. Brenner, do you remember the Pinewood Motor Lodge?" Voss began. "Sure. My mom worked there when I was a kid." "Do you remember October 1992? Kyle frowned, thinking. "Not specifically. That was a long time ago." Voss slid the registration card across the table. "Does the name Martin Cole mean anything to you?" Kyle studied the card, and David watched his face carefully. There, a flicker of recognition, quickly suppressed. "No. Should it? This card was filled out on October 10th, 1992 at the Pinewood Motor Lodge. The handwriting matches yours." "That's impossible. I wouldn't have registered at the motel. I was just a kid." "You were 14, old enough to know right from wrong." Voss leaned forward. "Kyle, we know Eugene Hartley murdered 7 people and hid their bodies at the motel. We know he had access to that property for years. What we're trying to understand is whether he had help." Kyle's face went pale. "I didn't help him kill anyone." "But you knew," Voss said quietly. "Didn't you?" The silence stretched out. David watched Kyle's face, saw the internal struggle, the weight of a secret carried for 23 years. "I didn't know at first," Kyle finally said, his voice barely audible. "I just thought Mr. Hartley was weird. He'd give me money sometimes to run errands for him, to not mention things I saw." "What things?" People going into rooms and not coming out. Strange noises at night. Once I saw him carrying something wrapped in a tarp to the back of the property. Kyle's hands shook. I was a kid. I didn't understand what I was seeing. When did you understand? Kyle closed his eyes. That weekend, October 1992, I was helping my mom clean rooms, and I saw the woman and the boy, the Brennans. They seemed nice, normal. The boy was playing his Game Boy in the parking lot while his mom talked to Mr. Hartley. What happened? That night I couldn't sleep. I'd stayed over in the motel office sometimes when my mom worked late. I heard voices, people calling out. It sounded like it was coming from under the ground. I went to investigate, and I found Mr. Hartley sitting outside room 7, just sitting there in the dark, smoking a cigarette. Kyle's voice cracked. I asked him what the noise was. He looked at me and said, "Sometimes people see things they shouldn't, and they have to be taught to keep quiet." Then he gave me $200 and told me to register in room 12 under a fake name to make it look like there were other guests that weekend. "And you did it," Voss said. I was terrified. I thought if I didn't do what he said, I'd end up wherever those voices were coming from. Tears ran down Kyle's face now. I knew something terrible was happening, but I was 14 years old and scared, and I told myself it wasn't my responsibility. The voices, David heard himself say through the speaker, even though Kyle couldn't hear him. How long did the voices continue? Voss glanced at the mirror, then asked the question. How long did you hear the voices calling out? Kyle's face crumpled. 3 days. 3 days of hearing them get weaker and weaker until they stopped. And I never told anyone. I took the money and I kept quiet and I let them die. David turned away from the glass, unable to watch anymore. His son had called out for help for 3 days, and a frightened teenager had heard him and done nothing. Voss found him in the hallway afterward. We're charging him with accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice. His lawyer will argue coercion and his age at the time. He'll likely serve some time, but nothing close to what Hartley got. He heard them, David said numbly. For 3 days he heard my family dying, and he did nothing. He was a child, Mr. Brennan, a terrified child. So was Owen. Voss had no answer to that. David drove home through falling snow, the winter landscape white and silent. He'd thought knowing the truth would bring closure, but each new revelation only opened deeper wounds. Claire and Owen hadn't died immediately. They'd spent 3 days in that underground room, hoping someone would hear them, would save them, and someone had heard them, and done nothing. The snow continued to fall as David pulled into his driveway. Inside the house, the boxes from the garage still waited. The accumulated evidence of lives that should have continued, futures that should have unfolded. He went inside and closed the door against the cold. But he couldn't close the door on what he now knew. The revelation about Kyle Brenner dominated the news cycle for weeks. The debate raged across television panels and internet forums. At what age is someone responsible for their inaction? Could a 14-year-old truly be held accountable for not reporting a crime when he feared for his own life? David avoided the news. He avoided the phone calls from journalists requesting interviews. He avoided everything except the one task that had begun to consume him, understanding exactly what had happened in those 3 days. He'd obtained copies of Owen's schoolwork from the Cedar Falls School District archives. He spread the papers across his dining room table. Math homework, book reports, a creative writing assignment about a family camping trip. Owen's handwriting had been neat for a 12-year-old, careful and precise. David traced the letters with his finger, imagining his son bent over these pages, concentrating. Had Owen tried to write something in that underground room? Had he scratched messages in the dirt or on the walls? David called Detective Voss. The forensic reports from the hidden room. Were there any written messages found? A pause. Mr. Brennan, I don't think... Please, I need to know." Voss sighed. "Yes, on the concrete wall, scratched with a rock or piece of metal. The forensic team photographed it but didn't include it in the public reports out of respect for your privacy." "What did it say?" "I'll send you the photographs, but David, it's going to be hard to see." The email arrived within the hour. David opened it with shaking hands. The photographs showed the concrete wall of the underground room, illuminated by forensic lighting. Scratched into the surface in desperate, uneven letters were messages. "Help us, please. My name is Owen Brennan. I am 12 years old. Somebody please hear us." And then, in what must have been Claire's handwriting, shakier but still legible, "We love you, David. We tried to come home." David sat staring at the photographs until the winter sun set and his dining room filled with darkness. These were his family's last words, scratched into concrete by hands that grew weaker each day. Messages that no one had read for 23 years. His phone rang. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Brennan, this is Father Thomas Morton from St. Catherine's Church in Green Bay." David frowned, trying to place the name. "I'm sorry, I don't..." "I'm Kyle Brenner's priest. He asked me to call you. He'd like to speak with you if you're willing." "I have nothing to say to him." "I understand. But he has something he needs to tell you. Something he didn't tell the police because he wasn't sure if it was real or just something his mind created to deal with the guilt." Despite himself, David was curious. What could he possibly tell me that would matter now? "He says he saw something. On the third night, when the voices from underground had almost stopped, he went back to the motel one more time and he saw someone else there. Someone talking to Eugene Hartley." David's grip tightened on the phone. "Who?" "He doesn't know, but he thinks you might be able to identify them if you saw a description. Please, Mr. Brennan. He's been carrying this for 23 years. Let him at least try to help now, even if it's too late." Against his better judgment, David agreed to meet. St. Catherine's was a small brick church in a quiet neighborhood of Green Bay. Father Morton met David at the door, a thin man in his 60s with kind eyes and a gentle handshake. "Thank you for coming. Kyle is in my office. I'll leave you two alone, but I'll be right outside if you need anything." Kyle Brenner stood when David entered, looking even more haggard than he had during the interrogation. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face drawn. "Mr. Brennan, thank you for... I didn't think you'd come." David remained standing by the door. "I'm here. Talk." Kyle nodded, swallowing hard. "The third night, October 12th, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the voices in my head even though they'd mostly stopped by then. I snuck out of my house and went back to the motel around midnight. Why? I don't know. Guilt, maybe. Some part of me thought I could still do something, could still help them." Kyle's voice broke. "When I got there, I saw Mr. Hartley's truck parked by room 7, and there was another vehicle, a dark sedan, I think, maybe dark blue or black. You didn't mention this to the police. I wasn't sure if it was real. I've gone over that night in my head so many times that I started to doubt my own memories. But there was someone else there. I saw them talking to Mr. Hartley near the office, just for a moment before I got scared and ran." "Did you see their face?" Kyle shook his head. "It was dark, and I was maybe 50 yards away. But I remember they were tall, taller than Mr. Hartley. They wore a long coat, dark-colored, and when they moved, they had a slight limp, like one leg was stiff or injured." David felt something stir in his memory. "Which leg?" "The left, I think. They kind of swung it when they walked." David closed his eyes, thinking back to 1992. Who had they known with a limp? Claire's co-workers at the hospital, neighbors, friends. Then it hit him. "Dr. Raymond Kowalsski," David said slowly. Kyle looked confused. "Who?" "He was Claire's supervisor at Cedar Falls General Hospital. He'd had knee surgery in early 1992. A sports injury that didn't heal properly. He had a pronounced limp for months afterward." David's mind raced. He was tall, maybe 6'2". He always wore long overcoats, even in mild weather. Why would Claire's supervisor be at the motel? That was the question David couldn't answer, but he remembered something else now. After Claire disappeared, Dr. Kowalsski had been helpful, almost excessively so. He'd organized search parties among the hospital staff. He'd called David regularly to check on him. He'd seemed genuinely devastated by Claire's disappearance. Or had it been something else? Guilt? Fear that something might be discovered? David pulled out his phone and called Voss immediately. She answered with her usual efficiency. Brennan. Raymond Kowalski. He was Claire's supervisor at the hospital. I need you to check if there's any connection between him and Eugene Hartley. What kind of connection are we looking for? David explained what Kyle had told him about the figure at the motel, the limp, the dark sedan. Kowalski had access to Claire's schedule. He would have known she was planning to visit her sister that weekend. He could have told Hartley when she'd be traveling. That's a significant leap, Mr. Brennan. Then check it out, please. Voss was silent for a moment. I'll look into it. Where are you? Green Bay, at St. Catherine's Church. Stay there. I'm sending officers to take Kyle's statement about what he saw. If there was another person involved, we need every detail he can remember. After David hung up, he looked at Kyle, who'd been listening to the one-sided conversation with growing comprehension. There was someone else, Kyle whispered. All these years, I thought it was just Mr. Hartley, but someone else knew. If you're right about what you saw, then yes. Kyle slumped back in his chair. I could have stopped all of it. If I'd just told someone that night, if I'd called the police. You were 14 and terrified, David said, surprising himself with the words. He didn't forgive Kyle. He didn't think he ever could. But standing here now, seeing the genuine anguish on the man's face, David recognized that some burdens were too heavy for anyone to carry alone, let alone a frightened child. It doesn't matter how old I was, Kyle said. Your family died because I was a coward. David didn't argue. He simply said, help the police now. Remember everything you can about that night. If Dr. Kowalski was involved, if he helped Hartley, then he needs to face justice too. Over the next several hours, Kyle worked with a police sketch artist, trying to recreate what he'd seen that October night in 1992. The figure by the motel office, the dark sedan, the way the person had moved, that distinctive limp. Meanwhile, Detective Voss began investigating Dr. Raymond Kowalski. She called David that evening with preliminary findings. Kowalski retired from Cedar Falls General Hospital in 1995, moved to Florida, lived there until 2008, then moved to Arizona. He's 72 years old now, living in a retirement community outside Phoenix. Has he been contacted? Not yet. I'm building a full background first. But David, I found something in the old case files. After Claire and Owen disappeared, Dr. Kowalski was interviewed as part of the standard investigation. They talked to everyone in Claire's life. He told police he'd been home alone the weekend of October 9th through 12th. No alibi, but also no reason to suspect him. What about phone records? Did he call the motel? This was 1992. Getting phone records required specific warrants, and there was no reason to request Kowalski's at the time. But I'm checking now to see if any of Hartley's records survive. If we can prove communication between them. David felt a cold determination settling over him. I'm going to Arizona. Mr. Brennan, you need to let us handle this. I let you handle Eugene Hartley, and that worked out. But I need to look Raymond Kowalski in the eye. I need to know if he's the person who gave my family to a killer. If you confront him, anything he says could be inadmissible in court. Then make sure you have your case built before I get there. David's voice was hard. Because I'm going, detective, with or without your cooperation. Voss sighed. Give me 48 hours. Let me gather what I can, build probable cause for an interview. Then I'll go with you to Arizona. Official capacity, everything on the record. Deal? David agreed, though 48 hours felt like an eternity. He drove back to Cedar Falls through the winter night, his mind turning over everything he'd learned. Claire's supervisor, someone she'd trusted, worked with, respected. Someone who might have arranged her death with the casual efficiency of a business transaction. When he reached his house on Birch Street, David went straight to his study. He pulled out an old photograph from 1991, a hospital Christmas party that Claire had insisted he attend. In the photo, Claire stood with several co-workers, smiling at the camera. And there, slightly apart from the group but unmistakably present, was Dr. Raymond Kowalsski. Tall, serious-faced, wearing one of his characteristic long dark coats. David studied the man's face, trying to see if there was anything that hinted at the monster beneath. But there was nothing. Just a middle-aged doctor at a Christmas party, looking slightly uncomfortable in the social setting. Evil didn't always look like Eugene Hartley's hollow-eyed menace. Sometimes it looked like everyone else. Detective Voss worked 18-hour days for the next 48 hours, building a case against Dr. Raymond Kowalsski. What she found painted a disturbing picture of a man who'd hidden his true nature behind professional respectability. Kowalsski had been Claire's supervisor at Cedar Falls General Hospital from 1988 to 1995. He'd been demanding, brilliant, and known for his volatile temper. 3 formal complaints had been filed against him by nursing staff, all dismissed by hospital administration. Claire's name appeared on one of those complaints, filed in August 1992, just 2 months before her disappearance. "What was the complaint about?" David asked when Voss called with the information. "Patient care decisions." Claire believed Kowalski had deliberately falsified medication records to cover up an error that had harmed a patient. She reported it through proper channels. The hospital investigated and found insufficient evidence. "Claire told me about that," David said slowly. "She came home furious one night, said her supervisor was dangerous and the hospital wouldn't do anything about it. I told her to be careful, to document everything." He paused. "She said she wasn't afraid of him." Voss continued digging. Financial records showed that in October 1992, Kowalski had withdrawn $5,000 in cash from his personal account, an unusual amount for a man who typically used credit cards for all purchases. The withdrawal was dated October 8th, the day before Claire and Owen had left for Duluth. Phone records were harder to obtain, but Voss found what she needed in an unexpected place. The Pinewood Motor Lodge's old office had contained a ledger where Eugene Hartley had manually recorded all incoming calls, a paranoid habit born from his distrust of phone companies. That ledger had been preserved as evidence. On October 7, 1992, a call had been placed to the Pinewood from a Cedar Falls number. Voss traced that number to a payphone that had once stood outside Cedar Falls General Hospital. "It's circumstantial," Voss admitted when she and David met at the airport for their flight to Phoenix. "But it's enough for a formal interview. If Kowalski talks, if he makes any admissions, we'll have him." The flight to Arizona was quiet. David stared out the window at the clouds below, thinking about Claire's complaint against Kowalski. She'd tried to hold him accountable, and 2 months later, she was dead. The timeline was damning. They landed in Phoenix on a bright February afternoon, the desert sun harsh after Wisconsin's winter gloom. Voss had coordinated with local police, who met them with an unmarked car and 2 plainclothes officers. Sunset Vista Retirement Community was exactly what its name suggested, a sprawling complex of neat adobe-style buildings with mountain views and palm trees. It looked peaceful, serene, the kind of place where elderly people came to enjoy their golden years. Dr. Raymond Kowalski lived in Unit 47, a ground-floor apartment with a small patio. Voss knocked on the door while David stood slightly behind her, his heart pounding. The man who answered the door was stooped with age, his face deeply lined, his once dark hair completely white. But he was still tall, and when he moved to open the door wider, David saw it. The stiff left leg, the slight hitch in his gait. "Dr. Kowalski?" Voss showed her badge. "I'm Detective Sarah Voss with the Wisconsin State Police. This is David Brennan. We'd like to speak with you about Claire and Owen Brennan." Kowalski's face went rigid. For just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Fear, or perhaps recognition that this moment had always been coming. Then his expression smoothed into careful neutrality. "That was a long time ago," he said. "I'm not sure what I could tell you that I didn't tell police back then." "New evidence has come to light," Voss said. "May we come in?" Kowalski hesitated, then stepped aside. "Of course." The apartment was neat, impersonal. Medical journals lined a bookshelf, but there were no photographs, no personal touches. Kowalski gestured to a sofa and took a chair across from them, his movements careful, controlled. "I was sorry to hear about Claire and Owen being found," he said. "Terrible tragedy." "You knew Claire well," Voss said, pulling out a notebook. "She worked under your supervision for 4 years. She was an excellent nurse, dedicated, thorough. She filed a complaint against you in August 1992. Kowalski's expression didn't change. "A misunderstanding about patient care. It was resolved internally." "Was it?" David spoke for the first time, his voice low and hard. "Or did you retaliate against her for trying to expose your negligence?" "Mr. Brennan, I understand you're grieving, but where were you the weekend of October 9th through 12th, 1992? Voss interrupted. "Home. I already told police that 23 years ago." "Alone." "I was divorced. Yes, alone." Voss pulled out a photograph, the sketch based on Kyle Brenner's description. "Do you recognize this person?" Kowalski barely glanced at it. "No." "Interesting. Because a witness places someone matching this description at the Pinewood Motor Lodge the night Claire and Owen Brennan died. Someone tall, with a limp in their left leg, wearing a long dark coat." Voss leaned forward. "Someone who spoke with Eugene Hartley outside room 7 around midnight on October 12th. "I don't know what you're talking about." "We have phone records showing a call from Cedar Falls General Hospital to the Pinewood Motor Lodge on October 7th. We have financial records showing you withdrew $5,000 in cash the day before Claire left town. We have testimony that you knew her travel plans." Voss's voice remained calm, professional. "Dr. Kowalski, this is your opportunity to tell us what happened. If there are mitigating circumstances, if Hartley coerced you somehow." "I want a lawyer," Kowalski said flatly. The interrogation was over. But as Voss stood to leave, David remained seated, staring at Kowalski. The older man met his gaze, and in that moment, David saw something that confirmed everything. Not guilt exactly, but a cold calculation, an assessment of how much David knew and how much could be proven. "She trusted you," David said quietly. "She worked beside you, respected your expertise, and you gave her to a killer. Why?" Kowalski said nothing. "Was it revenge for the complaint? Or was it something else? Something darker?" Still silence. David stood, moving closer to Kowalski. "My son was 12 years old. He scratched messages on the walls of that room, begging for help. Did you know they were alive for 3 days? Did Hartley tell you they were calling out? Did you think about that while you went about your life, treating patients, pretending to be a healer?" "Mr. Brennan," Voss said warningly. But David couldn't stop. "You're 72 years old. You'll die soon, probably in some hospital bed with nurses caring for you. You'll die comfortable and clean and medicated. My wife and son died in the dark, terrified and alone. Where's the justice in that?" Kowalski's face remained impassive, but his hands trembled slightly. The Phoenix police arrested him an hour later based on the evidence Voss had gathered. His lawyer arrived, expensive and efficient, already talking about circumstantial evidence and the difficulty of prosecuting crimes from 2 decades past. But David had seen Kowalski's face. He'd seen the calculation, the cold assessment. That was the face of someone who'd committed an unforgivable act and thought he'd gotten away with it. That night, unable to sleep in his Phoenix hotel room, David received a call from an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Brennan?" An elderly voice, cultured, careful. "This is Dr. Kowalski." David sat up, instantly alert. "How did you get this number?" "I'm calling from the detention center. They allowed me one call." A pause. "I wanted to tell you something before my lawyer forbids it." "I'm recording this call," David lied. "I don't care." Kowalski's voice was tired now, the careful control slipping. "You asked why. You deserve to know why." David waited, his heart pounding. "Claire saw me make a mistake. A patient died because I prescribed the wrong dosage. She knew, and she reported it. The hospital buried it, but she wouldn't let it go. She kept pushing, kept questioning." Kowalski's voice hardened. "She was going to destroy my career, my reputation, everything I'd built. So you killed her." "I made a phone call. I told an acquaintance about a problem I had, and he offered a solution. I gave him Claire's travel plans and $5,000. I didn't ask questions about how he'd handle it." "Eugene Hartley wasn't an acquaintance. How did you know him?" A long silence. Then, "We met at a medical conference in 1989. He was working security at the hotel. We talked, discovered we had similar views about people who interfered in our business. He told me about the motel, about the room. He said he could make problems disappear." David felt sick. "You knew what he was. You knew he'd killed before." "I suspected, but I told myself it didn't matter. Claire had become a liability." Kowalski's voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't know about the boy. Hartley said he'd handle Claire. I didn't know she'd bring her son. Does that make you feel better? That you only meant to murder one of them?" "No, nothing makes it better. I've lived with what I did for 23 years. Every patient I treated afterward, I saw Claire's face. Every child I examined, I saw your son." Kowalski's voice cracked. "I'm 72 years old, and I'm going to die in prison. But before I do, I wanted you to know the truth. All of it." The call ended. David sat in the darkness of his hotel room, the phone still in his hand. He'd wanted answers, and now he had them. Dr. Raymond Kowalski had ordered his wife's death over a professional grievance. Eugene Hartley had carried it out. Kyle Brenner had heard Claire and Owen dying and done nothing. 3 people, each contributing to the destruction of his family, and David was left to carry the weight of knowing. The trial of Dr. Raymond Kowalski began on a humid morning in late August, 9 months after his arrest. The prosecution had built their case methodically. Phone records, financial transactions, testimony from Kyle Brenner, and most damning of all, Kowalski's recorded confession to David from the detention center. The defense argued that the confession was coerced, that Kowalski had been medicated and not in his right mind. They pointed to his age, his deteriorating health, his lack of prior violent offenses. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. David sat in the courtroom as the verdict was read, watching Kowalski's face remain expressionless. The old doctor showed no emotion as he was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit hanging loose on his diminished frame. Outside the courthouse, Detective Voss found David standing alone under a tree, watching the news cameras pack up their equipment. "It's over," she said quietly. "Is it?" Voss had no answer to that. Eugene Hartley had died 2 months earlier in prison, a massive heart attack in the middle of the night. He'd served less than a year of his life sentence. Some people said it was justice, a quick death for a man who'd caused so much suffering. Others said it was mercy he didn't deserve. David thought it was simply the random cruelty of the universe. Hartley was gone, beyond punishment or redemption. Kowalski would spend his remaining years in prison, dying slowly of the cancer diagnosis he'd received shortly after his arrest. And Kyle Brenner had been sentenced to 3 years for obstruction of justice, eligible for parole after 18 months. He'd serve his time in a minimum security facility, a punishment that seemed inadequate but legally appropriate for a crime committed when he was 14. 3 people who'd destroyed David's life, each facing consequences that seemed both too much and too little. That evening, David returned to his hotel room and found a letter that had been slipped under his door. The envelope was plain, no return address. Inside was a single handwritten page. "Mr. Brennan, I know I have no right to write to you, and if you throw this away without reading it, I understand. But I wanted you to know that I've spent every day since October 1992 trying to atone for what I didn't do. After that weekend, I became a volunteer firefighter. I've pulled people from burning buildings, performed CPR on strangers, worked accident scenes in the middle of the night. I've saved lives because I couldn't save your family. It doesn't balance the scales. Nothing ever will. But I needed you to know that I heard your son calling for help, and that sound has never left me. I think about Owen every day. I think about the life he should have lived. I'm sorry. I'll be sorry until the day I die. Kyle Brenner." David read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in his jacket pocket. He didn't forgive Kyle. He didn't think he could. But he acknowledged the attempt at redemption, the effort to transform guilt into something meaningful. The next morning, David drove to the cemetery where Claire and Owen had finally been laid to rest. Their graves were side by side under an oak tree, the headstones simple but dignified. He'd had Owen's last message engraved on his stone. "I wanted to be a history teacher like my dad." David stood before the graves for a long time, the late summer sun warm on his shoulders. 23 years of not knowing where they were, of imagining worst-case scenarios that turned out to be horrifyingly accurate. 23 years of hoping they might somehow still be alive, despite all logic and evidence. Now, he knew everything, every terrible detail, and somehow that knowing was both better and worse than the uncertainty had been. "I found them," David said quietly to the graves. "The people who did this to you. They're being punished. It won't bring you back, but at least there's justice. At least the truth is known." The wind rustled through the oak leaves overhead, the only response. David pulled out his phone and called Detective Voss. "I'm ready to go home." "Good," she said. "Take care of yourself, David. Thank you for everything." The drive back to Cedar Falls took most of the day. David stopped at the old site of the Pinewood Motor Lodge, now completely cleared and rebuilt as a truck stop. There was nothing left of the motel, no trace of the horrors that had occurred there, just concrete and fuel pumps and the constant flow of travelers who had no idea what lay beneath their feet. David didn't get out of the car. He simply sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, remembering the day the demolition crew had found the hidden room. That had been the beginning of the end, the moment when uncertainty transformed into terrible knowledge. When he finally reached his house on Birch Street, the sun was setting. David pulled into the driveway and sat in the car, looking at the home he'd shared with Claire and Owen. For 23 years, he'd maintained it exactly as it had been the day they left, their belongings still in place, their rooms unchanged, as if at any moment they might walk through the door. But they weren't coming home. They never were. It was time to accept that. David went inside and began the process he'd been avoiding for decades. He packed up Claire's clothes, her jewelry, her books. He boxed Owen's toys, his schoolwork, his Game Boy that had been returned by the police after the investigation concluded. Some things he would keep, photographs, letters, Claire's nursing school diploma. But the rest, the accumulated possessions of interrupted lives, he donated to charity or gave to family members who'd known and loved them. It took 3 days to transform the house from a shrine to the past into simply a house. When it was done, David stood in the empty spaces and felt something he hadn't felt in 23 years. Not peace, not exactly, but perhaps the beginning of acceptance. His family was gone. The people responsible had been caught and punished. The truth had been revealed in all its ugliness. And David was still here, still alive, still carrying the burden of memory. But maybe, finally, he could start to move forward. That night, David sat in his living room, newly rearranged, some furniture removed, Claire's favorite chair donated to her sister, and opened a journal. He'd never been much for writing, but Detective Voss had suggested it might help. "Write down what you remember," she'd said. "The good things, before October 1992. David started with the day he'd met Claire, a hospital fundraiser in 1975, both of them young and optimistic and full of dreams about the future. She'd been wearing a blue dress, he remembered. She'd laughed at his terrible jokes. He wrote about their wedding, about buying the house on Birch Street, about the day Owen was born. He wrote about family vacations and quiet Sunday mornings and the 1,000 small moments that make up a life together. The painful memories would always be there. But David realized he'd been so focused on the horror of how Claire and Owen died that he'd almost forgotten the joy of how they'd lived. That needed to change. He wrote late into the night, filling pages with memories he'd kept locked away because they hurt too much to examine. But now, with the truth finally known and justice finally served, David allowed himself to remember. And in remembering, he began to heal. 5 years later, on a crisp October afternoon, David Brennan stood in front of a classroom at Cedar Falls Community College. He'd come out of retirement at the college's request, teaching a single course, The History of Criminal Justice in America. His students were engaged, asking thoughtful questions about due process, evidence standards, the evolution of forensic science. David answered them with the authority of someone who'd lived through the criminal justice system from the most painful perspective possible. After class, a young woman approached his desk. "Professor Brennan, I wanted to thank you for sharing your story. About your family, it must be difficult to talk about." "It was," David admitted. "But I think it's important. The system isn't perfect, but it can work, eventually." The student nodded and left, and David packed up his materials. He'd started speaking publicly about the Brennan case 3 years ago, after a victims' rights organization had invited him to share his experience. He'd been reluctant at first, but he'd discovered that telling the story, honestly, completely, helped others who were navigating similar tragedies. He'd also discovered it helped him. The nightmares had faded, though they hadn't disappeared entirely. Sometimes he still woke in the darkness, imagining he heard Owen's voice calling for help. But those moments were becoming less frequent, less overwhelming. David drove home through streets that had once felt haunted by absence, but now simply felt familiar. He'd sold the house on Birch Street 2 years ago, moved to a smaller place near the college. The new house had no memories of Claire and Owen. That had felt like betrayal at first, but now it felt like necessary distance. Their photographs still adorned his walls, but they no longer dominated every space. David had learned to live alongside his grief rather than inside it. His phone rang as he pulled into his driveway. Detective Voss, calling with her annual update. "David, thought you'd want to know. Kyle Brenner completed his parole successfully. He's been working full-time as a firefighter and EMT. By all accounts, he's turned his life around." "Good," David said, and meant it. "Also, I got word that Dr. Kowalski's health has deteriorated significantly. His doctors give him a few months at most." David felt nothing at this news. Not satisfaction, not anger, nothing. Kowalski had become irrelevant, a footnote in a story that belonged to Claire and Owen, not to their killers. "Thanks for letting me know, Sarah." After they hung up, David sat in his car for a moment, looking at the modest house that was his home now. Inside were books he was reading, papers he needed to grade, a life that continued despite everything. Claire and Owen would have been 54 and 42 this year. He thought about that sometimes, the lives they should have lived, the people they would have become. Owen would have been a teacher, probably, carrying on the family tradition. Claire would have risen through the ranks at the hospital, perhaps becoming a head nurse or administrator. They should have had those futures. The fact that they didn't would always be a wound David carried. But he was learning that healing didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean the pain disappeared. It meant learning to carry the weight without letting it crush you. David went inside, made dinner, graded papers. Later, he would call Claire's sister Catherine in Duluth, their weekly conversation that kept the connection to his former life alive. Tomorrow, he would teach another class, help another student understand the complexities of justice and truth. And on Saturday, he would drive to the cemetery and visit the graves of his wife and son, bringing fresh flowers and news of his week. He would tell them about his students, about the small victories and setbacks of daily life. He would tell them they were still loved, still remembered. The truth had been revealed. The guilty had been punished. The dead had been laid to rest, and somehow, impossibly, David had survived. The autumn sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. David stood at his window, watching the light fade, thinking about time and loss and the strange resilience of the human heart. 28 years since that October morning when Claire and Owen had driven away, waving from the car window. 28 years of grief and searching, and finally, knowing. It wasn't the life David had imagined, but it was the life he had, and he was learning to live it with something approaching grace. Somewhere in the fading light, he imagined he could hear Claire's voice, telling him it was okay to move forward. Owen's laughter, bright and young and forever 12. They were gone. They had been gone for a very long time. But in David's memory, in the stories he told and the lessons he taught, they endured. And that would have to be enough.